Don't we all love St. Peter? Isn't Peter a man after our own hearts? The stories of Peter, like the one we hear today in our gospel, are very powerful for us. Peter was a bold man, but also a very fickle man. A man who, again, is one after our own hearts. But even more importantly, he's someone who is after Jesus' heart, or Jesus is after his heart, to put it more precisely. After all, he is the one that Jesus picks not only to be part of the 12 apostles, but also actually to be the leader of the apostles, the leader of the early church. And so Jesus is willing to deal with our fallen humanity, with our brokenness, just as he was willing to deal with it in Peter as well. St. John Henry Newman said about this passage, said about Jesus, "He who could walk the waters could also ride triumphantly upon what is still more fickle, unstable, tumultuous, and treacherous. The billows of human wills, human purposes, and human hearts." In other words, our human fickleness, our human changes of heart are much more treacherous than the stormiest sea could ever be. And yet Jesus is willing to enter into the midst of that. We see how Peter goes from one minute to being scared, next minute to being very bold and stepping out of the boat and asking to walk on the water, and then very quickly becomes scared once again. And this is what happens for us too in various ways. Those waves of different emotions that come over us, we can be very fickle. And yet we are called to be like Peter in being bold as well. That Peter does have a boldness that attracts Jesus in terms of calling him to his special vocation. So we see a similar thing with in our first reading today with the prophet Elijah, famous passage from the first book of Kings. Before this, Elijah had that encounter with the 450 prophets of Baal. And remember that Elijah was very bold in that encounter with those prophets of Baal. Remember that he mocked the prophets of Baal whenever they were trying to offer the sacrifice. What happened is both groups, both Elijah and these prophets of Baal, were to build a sacrificial fire. But they weren't actually to light the fire. They were to wait on God or their gods to light the fire for them. Well, the prophets of Baal tried and tried in these various ways, dancing around the fire to call upon their gods to light the fire, and yet nothing happened. Elijah mocks them, saying maybe they're asleep or resting, your gods. And then Elijah is bold in that he takes the fire and he pours water all around it, he pours a trench all around it, making it more difficult to be lit on fire. And then all the things that he does doesn't prevent God from coming in and acting. God acts boldly in setting that fire and proving who the true God is in that relationship. So this leads to Elijah proclaiming the death of the 450 prophets of Baal for their false worship. And after they're killed, it's the queen Jezebel, who is a supporter of the prophets of Baal, says, "I'm going to now kill you, Elijah." So Elijah has to flee. So Elijah goes from very bold to very scared by the time he reaches Mount Horeb, which was also Mount Sinai. And so we see the same situation, a man who is bold and yet also now falls into fear because of all that he is facing. And just as Jesus acts in the life of Peter in that moment, as Peter cries out, so Elijah, in crying out for God, encounters God. But he encounters him not in the wind or the earthquake or these various dramatic events that take place. Instead, he encounters him in that tiny whispering sound. And so it's that passage that so perfectly points us toward prayer, the need for quiet prayer. And so on our readings today really point us to the need both for boldness, but also for prayer. To be bold and to be prayerful. That Peter was a bold man, but his boldness was a bit worldly. It had to be purified by Jesus. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the famous Lutheran pastor who stood up to the Nazis and so was executed in 1945, wrote a book called The Cost of Discipleship. And he writes about this passage saying that Peter had to leave the ship and risk his life on the sea in order to learn both his weakness and the almighty power of his Lord. If Peter had not taken the risk, he would never have learned the meaning of faith. The road to faith passes through obedience to the call of Jesus. Unless a definitive step is demanded, the call vanishes into thin air. And if people can imagine they can follow Jesus without taking the step, they are deluding themselves. And so, as Dietrich Bonhoeffer speaks about the fact that Peter must take the step of faith. Number one, to learn humility, to learn that he has to trust more deeply in Jesus, that Jesus actually allows him to walk on the water, and yet his faith fails once he starts to see the storm around him and the waves around him. But it also shows the power of Christ, the power of Jesus. Both those elements are lessons that Peter comes to learn. And so God calls us as well to be bold, to step out in faith. And we see that in so many ways. That just like Peter, we're called to see where the Lord wants us to step out in faith, but to do it in prayer, to do it with trust and faith in the Lord. You know, I had a chance to do a summer program one summer in my seminary life, a couple of years into my seminary career, if you will, that there was a summer that was free, that I didn't have any responsibilities or obligations the diocese had given me. So I was free to pursue whatever I wanted for that summer, for those few months. And I decided I did want to do some kind of work that was going to test me. Now, I'm not a very bold person. I'm an introverted person. I'm a person who, likes comfort, and like probably many Catholics as well, is someone that's not always that comfortable stepping out with boldness and proclaiming Christ and serving Christ in various ways. So one way I particularly wasn't bold, or wasn't a strong suit of mine, something I knew nothing about, was to work with children. So the program was a program in the state of North Dakota, a place I'd never been before, to go and do summer camps with other young people, college students. In this case, I was a little bit older than them, because I was in my later 20s, as they were in their early 20s or even younger. But I was able to work with college students going from town to town throughout the summer to offer summer camps for the children, Bible camps for that summer. And it was a bold step for me, because I grew up as an only child, know little about working with children, and so it was something very bold in my life that I stepped out. And I learned a lot during that summer. It tested me in many ways to learn how to work with children from 9 to 3 every day, and to see the different situations in terms of some kids that were tougher to deal with, of course, than others, and to enter into those circumstances of being a team leader and working with other young women as part of this process. All of it was a learning experience for me in different ways, as an only child and one who hadn't worked much, been around much small children. And so it was a powerful, encounter of boldness that the Lord worked in that way that I was poor, those ways I couldn't really fulfill what God was asking me to do on my own efforts alone. I needed to go to the Lord. So it drove me certainly into a deeper sense of prayer. In fact, one of the churches that we went to, a beautiful church in a small town called Warsaw, North Dakota, as you went into the church, it was a Polish church built in the early 1900s, a beautiful church. On the right-hand side of the sanctuary was a large painting of this very scene of Peter sinking and Jesus reaching out his hand to pull him up. So God is calling us to live more faithfully, to live more boldly, and to live more prayerfully. Those words of Jesus to Peter are words that we must take to heart. "Oh, you of little faith, why do you doubt?" They're words both of rebuke, but also of encouragement. They challenge us, but they also call us to something deeper. And so we can then ask those questions. How can we be bold in the Lord? And the key is to enter into that spiritual poverty, which just that means that thing that I can't do, or I know that I can't do on my own efforts. This is what we call spiritual poverty. This is what Jesus says in the first Beatitude: "Blessed are the poor in spirit, the kingdom of God is theirs." We must be poor in spirit, recognizing where we are and where we can't do it on our own. And this requires us to go into a deeper sense of prayer. We must be people of prayer, to understand the gifts that the Lord has in store for us, to enter into the spiritual poverty. So maybe it's there's a need that I see, and I say, well, I really don't know how to do that. Well, good. Maybe God is calling you to step out in boldness, to say, maybe you don't know how to do it, but submit yourselves to me and I'll teach you how. Or maybe it's to help out and reach out to physically poor, those who are materially poor. Now we say, well, I don't know anything about doing that either. Well, maybe you offer to buy someone a sandwich that's in need. That's a bold step to take for many of us who aren't used to that type of thing. Whatever it is, God is calling us to step out in faith and boldness. So the point is we want to live boldly, but we also want to pray boldly as well, and pray in a deep and powerful way. Right? Peter stepped out in faith boldly, he acted boldly, but he also prayed boldly. He cried out, Lord, save me, which was a very powerful and a very honest prayer, which is a prayer that we often are afraid to make because we are afraid to admit that we can't do this thing that is before us, or that we're struggling to do it with our own effort alone. So it's Jesus alone who can make us truly bold, yet also make us humble and prayerful, to bring us that spiritual poverty that is needed to do the will of Christ in our lives. And so we recognize the gift of the boldness of Peter, also his struggles, his fickleness, because we too can fluctuate between boldness and being fickle. And so we thank the Lord for his offering to Peter today, that he's willing to allow Peter to walk on the water, but also to fail, to show that Jesus can allow us to do great things. Well, he tells us we must keep our eyes on him at all times so we can fulfill them and live them out. And so Jesus wants us to live boldly, but also prayerfully in the things that we do, to come with humility and spiritual poverty in our lives. And so the Lord wants to say to us today, I know how to do everything, even walk on the water. I know you better than you know yourself. Empty yourself and let me save you. Let me show you the way. You are my beloved. I will not let you sink. I will not let you drown. Be at peace and be bold in following me.